Charles Beaumont sat in the high-backed leather chair, fingers drumming on the polished wood of his desk. He glanced at the family portrait on the wall. In it, a younger Charles stood beside his own stern father, a respected real estate magnate. Charles remembered the day that photo was taken. He was 10, and he stood tall in a crisp suit that did not match his small frame. His father's arm rested on his shoulder like a crown. The moment felt heavy, as if he carried both his fathers, pride and his expectations all at once. Over the years, Charles had learned to carry that weight with a straight back and measured calm. When he was old enough, he took over the family business and turned it into a vast empire. Luxurious towers rose in city centers. Exclusive neighborhoods sprawled across green hills. And Charles's name became linked with success. He spent his days in glossy boardrooms and his nights at elegant dinners. But something was missing. William, his only child, grew up in that same world of glass and marble. From the day he was born, he was surrounded by tutors, expensive toys, and a small army of attendants. Yet when Charles looked at his boy, sometimes he felt like a stranger watching from afar. He saw William learn to tie his tie before he learned to tie his shoelaces. He saw William's laughter echo in empty halls, unaccompanied by the warmth of fatherly conversation. As Charles prepared for William's 21st birthday, he thought it would be different. This year, he planned a lavish gala at their countryside estate. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings of the grand hall, silk drapes in soft gold-framed tall windows that overlooked rolling lawns. White and pink roses climbed the stone walls outside, their scent drifting in through open doors. Charles imagined the evening as a masterpiece of his love and success. Invitations went out weeks in advance. Only a select few would attend: top clients, powerful partners, and old friends from the industry. Charles paid careful attention to every detail. There would be a 6-piece orchestra playing soft melodies in the corner. A 5-course dinner would be served by a team of experienced chefs. Champagne would flow freely, and fireworks would light up the night sky. Charles thought of all of it as a grand gesture to celebrate William's coming of age and to announce him to the world. Yet despite the grandeur, Charles remained distant from the event. He spoke with the event planner about the menu. He approved the floral arrangements and discussed security details. But he did not find time to ask William how he felt about the celebration. He did not take a moment to ask if his son felt ready to step into the spotlight. He did not think to ask if William even wanted a gala. Charles assumed that wealth and spectacle would speak louder than any words of care. On the day of the party, the weather was clear and warm. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the estate. Inside, staff bustled about, adjusting vases and tidying chairs. Outside, guests in evening wear arrived in sleek cars. They stepped onto red carpets and paused for photographers stationed at the entrance. The air buzzed with polite greetings and laughter. William stood at the top of the grand staircase. He wore a borrowed tuxedo that felt too stiff and uncomfortable. His own suit was lost in a shipment mix-up, so he settled for the rental. He ran a nervous hand through his hair and tried to steady his breathing. Smiling guests passed by him, but he felt an ache in his chest. He wished his father would come stand next to him. He wished his father would put an arm around him and say, "I'm proud of you." Charles watched from behind a column. He adjusted his cufflink and admired the scene. From here he could see the rows of white chairs, the long tables set with crystal glasses, and the lights beginning to glow as the sun dipped below the horizon. He felt pleased with himself. This party would be remembered. It would be the night the Beaumont name shone brightest. At that moment, William took a hesitant step forward. He moved toward a water station near the kitchen entrance. His hand reached for a glass, but a voice cut through the soft music and the chatter. "Excuse me," the voice snapped. It belonged to a hired attendant, a young woman in a crisp black uniform. "You can't take that. Please get out of the way." William froze. He looked down at himself, confused by her tone. He straightened his tie and said politely, "I'm sorry, I was just getting a glass of water." The attendant frowned. She turned to a burly security guard standing nearby. Before William could explain, the guard grabbed his arm firmly. "You don't belong here," the guard said. Come with me." Fear clenched at William's heart. He tried to speak, but the guard led him out of the kitchen door and into the cool evening air. William's eyes darted around. Guests continued to arrive, unaware of what was happening. The guard marched him across the lawn, dragging him away from the bright lights. Inside, Charles heard the silence. Soft strains of the orchestra faltered. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People turned in their seats. Charles pushed away the column and rushed toward the main doors, but the crowd blocked his path. He made his way through clusters of guests until he burst outside. There, under the pale light of lanterns lining the garden path, he saw William standing with his coat collar turned up against the breeze. The guard had let go of his arm, but William did not move. He stood like a statue. Charles's heart thumped in his chest. He wanted to reach out, to hug him, to tell him it was all a mistake. Yet Charles did not move. He froze, struck by the sight of his son, treated like a common intruder. He saw the boy he had raised in luxury, the boy he had loved from afar, standing, alone and confused in the dark. The moment felt like a mirror held up to his own heart, reflecting a distance he had never noticed before. Guests spilled out onto the lawn now, drawn by the disruption. Some whispered to each other. Others reached for their phones to record the scene. Charles realized that his gala had become a spectacle for all the wrong reasons. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, tasting the cool air. He felt a tightness in his throat and a sudden clarity in his mind. In that instant, Charles knew he could not let this stand. He could not allow William to feel invisible in his own home. The walls he had built around the party and around himself were fragile. They must come down before they shattered everything he cared about. Charles stepped forward, his mind made up. He would act, and he would do so with every ounce of conviction he possessed. The night had already begun with a mistake. Oh, it was time to make things right. He squared his shoulders and started across the lawn, toward the guard and his son. In that decision, a new chapter between father and son was about to begin. One that held promise of something neither had known before, true connection. Charles raced across the lawn, his polished shoes kicking up small clouds of dust as lantern light flickered on his path. He felt his heart thundering in his chest, and every breath felt too loud. William stood a few feet away, head lowered, shoulders tense, as if he carried the guard's rough grip still on them. Other guests stood frozen, mid-step, unsure whether to move forward or step back. The soft music from the orchestra had stopped, leaving only the distant chirp of crickets and the muffled voices of security staff. "Let him go," Charles said, his voice low but firm. He reached the guard and spoke his name for the first time that night. "I am Charles Beaumont. This is my son." The guard blinked, taken aback by the authority in Charles's tone and the sudden recognition in his eyes. He glanced at the attendant who had called William a servant, and his own eyes widened as he realized his mistake. William looked up, confusion and relief mixing on his face. The guard released his arm and straightened his posture, shifting from bluffing confidence to stammering apology. Charles kept his gaze steady. He wanted no hesitation now. He wanted William to feel safe. "Return inside," Charles told the guard, nodding toward the hall. "Tell everyone what happened. Then stand down." The guard scrambled to obey, backing away with the attendant close behind. They headed for the doors, their footsteps echoing on the stone path. Guests stirred at the commotion and began moving toward the front doors, their murmurs rising like a wave. Charles stepped forward and placed a hand on William's shoulder, guiding him back toward the entrance. William's borrowed tuxedo felt even stiffer than before. But the warmth of his father's hand was something new, something he had longed for. Inside, the grand hall fell silent as the doors swung open. Candlelight revealed the rows of tables, set for dinner, and the orchestra bowing their heads in surprise. Charles walked in, William at his side. Every eye turned toward them. Some guests held champagne flutes frozen in midair. Others leaned forward, curiosity shining on their faces. Charles's voice rang out clearly over the hush. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. His baritone carried through the hall, calm yet resolute. "This young man here is my son, William Beaumont. He is not a servant or an intruder." A ripple of astonished gasps passed through the crowd. He took a step closer to the raised platform where the orchestra had begun to gather. With deliberate ease, he removed the microphone stand from its hook and held it before him. Silence deepened. As he raised a hand for attention, "I apologize for the confusion," he continued, looking first at William and then at the assembled guests. "But more than that, I apologize to my son." Some guests exchanged puzzled glances. A few photographers moved to capture the moment, flashlights popping in the half-darkness. Charles glanced toward them with a slight nod, acknowledging that this scene was one he could not erase. Instead, he would use it to make his point clear. He turned back to the crowd and spoke from the heart. "In building this business and in planning this gala, I forgot something far more important than any deal or display: respect and kindness." He paused, giving weight to each word. "I forgot that family deserves the greatest courtesy of all. Tonight, that mistake was laid bare." William felt his pulse quicken as heads turned toward him. He stood beside his father, feeling both small and suddenly larger than he had ever been. Charles placed an arm gently around him. "From now on," Charles said, "my son will shine in the light of his own right. No one here is to treat him as anything less than who he is, a Beaumont and my heir." A soft murmur of approval rose. Through the hall, glasses clinked as guests nodded in understanding. The orchestra quietly picked up a gentle tune again, and the murmur grew into polite applause. William allowed himself a small, grateful smile. He had never seen his father move so boldly, so quickly to defend him. Charles motioned for the guard, and the attendant to join them on the platform. The guard stepped forward and stood at attention. The attendant followed, head bowed. Charles addressed them directly. "You both acted without knowing the whole story. I'll talk with you later. For now, please leave the guests in peace." The guard and the attendant retreated, faces red but relieved. The crowd's attention remained on Charles and William. Charles coughed softly, cleared his throat, then handed the microphone to William. William froze for a moment, uncertain. Then his father placed a hand on his back. "Say something," Charles whispered, so only William could hear. "Tell them what you feel." William took a steadying breath. He looked at the sea of faces. There were people he'd seen before but never spoken to. Now that he stood here, he felt a surge of courage he had not expected. Lifted the microphone and spoke. "Thank you," William began in a quiet voice. "Thank you, Father, for standing up for me." He paused. His voice wavered at first, but he found his strength. "I have lived in this house, at the edge of these gardens, and behind these walls all my life. I loved every inch of it, but sometimes I felt invisible, even with these grand halls around me." He glanced at the chandelier overhead and then back to his father. "Tonight, you reminded me that I matter." The audience listened in respectful silence. Some eyes glistened. Charles felt a lump in his throat. He looked at his son with pride. William continued, "I know I have much to learn about our work and our family legacy, but all I need is a chance to walk these halls with my head held high, to earn respect, and to share in our family's name." William's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "I promise to work hard, to honor you, and to never forget that family is more important than fortune." Swelling cheer rose from the crowd. Hands pounded on tables in applause. William lowered the microphone, and Charles enveloped him in a warm embrace. The music swelled, and the guests resumed their seats, vibrantly discussing what they had just witnessed. As the evening resumed, Charles guided William to the head table. He introduced him to every guest as a partner in his business, and as a son he would always protect. William greeted each person with a genuine smile and a firm handshake, feeling for the first time that he belonged. The chef served the first course of dinner, and plates were passed down the table. Glasses filled again with champagne. Laughter returned, richer and more heartfelt than before. Charles and William sat side by side, talking quietly as the soft glow of candles flickered around them later. After the main meal, Charles and William slipped away from the crowd. They found a quiet corner of the terrace, overlooking the moonlit gardens. They sat together on a wrought iron bench. William leaned his head on his father's shoulder. Charles put an arm around him, feeling the steady warmth of his son against him. "I'm sorry," Charles whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I didn't see how my actions hurt you." William looked up at him, eyes reflecting the soft moonlight. "It's okay," William said. "I know you love me. You showed me that tonight." He smiled and nudged his father lightly. Charles smiled back, relief washing over him. "From now on," he said, "we face everything together. No secrets, no distance." William nodded. Together, he repeated softly. They sat in silence, watching the roses sway in the gentle breeze. Somewhere inside the house, a violinist played a tender melody. The night felt full of possibility. Father and son had crossed a line together from silence into speech, from distance into closeness. In that shared moment, they began a new chapter one, built on respect, love, and the promise of many conversations yet to come. Charles and William returned inside, the soft glow of candlelight guiding their steps back into the grand hall. The party had changed. Where once polite chatter had floated through the air, now guests exchanged warm greetings and smiles, as if hearing music for the first time. Charles guided William through the crowd, introducing him not only as his son, but as his partner. William felt a thrill of pride each time a guest paused to congratulate him. He answered questions about his studies, his interests, and even his dreams, things he had rarely shared aloud before. After dinner, Charles led William to his private study, a room lined with shelves of books and ledgers. The study smelled of polished wood and old paper. Charles motioned for William to sit at the long mahogany desk. On the desk lay plans for a new development project along the riverbank. Charles opened the folder and slid blueprints toward his. "Son, tell me what you think," Charles said, leaning back in his chair. William felt a flutter of nerves. This was more important than any speech he had given moments earlier. He studied the plans. Small townhouses with gardens, community center at the end of the row, and walking paths along the water. He imagined children playing on the grass, neighbors greeting each other as they passed by. "These homes feel too grand," William said softly. "They look beautiful, but will families feel welcome? What if we added a playground or a community garden space?" Charles's eyes lit up. He adjusted his glasses, leaned forward, and said, "I like that idea." "Tell me more," William suggested. "A vegetable patch where neighbors could plant tomatoes, peppers, or lettuce." He pictured benches around the patch, built by future homeowners, where grandparents and grandchildren could sit together. Charles nodded and made notes on the blueprint's margin. William felt a sense of purpose swell inside him. Here was a chance to shape something real, something that could bring people together. They worked late into the evening, the glow from a single lamp illuminating their conversation. Charles shared stories of earlier projects, mistakes he had made, lessons he had learned about balancing beauty with practicality. William listened closely, asking questions, imagining how each solution would feel to someone moving into those homes. For the first time, William felt a true connection to his father's work. Not as an observer, but as an active creator. By the time they finished, the study was quiet and the moon hung low in the sky outside tall windows. Charles closed the folder and turned off the lamp. He looked at William with a gentle smile. "You've given me fresh ideas," he said. "I'm proud of you," William beamed. He realized how rare it was to hear those words directly, and he treasured the moment. In the days that followed, the story of the gala spread through town. Newspapers ran photos of Charles and William standing together, the headline praising the billionaire's public apology and warm embrace. Charles ignored the praise. His focus was on the new plans for the riverbank project and on finding ways to include community voices. He invited local families to a meeting in the old town hall. William joined him, standing at his side as they welcomed neighbors to share their thoughts. At first, some residents hesitated to speak. They had seen Charles's buildings in glossy ads, but had never met the man himself. When William asked a mother what her children needed most, she paused, then answered that they wanted safe places to play and paths to ride their bikes. An elderly man said he missed small shops within walking distance. places where he could chat with shopkeepers instead of driving to a big store. William took notes, as if he were writing a story. And Charles listened with genuine interest. By the end of the meeting, neighbors felt heard and valued. Charles promised to adjust his plans to include a playground, a small retail row, and a community garden. William watched as his father shook hands with each person, making eye contact and thanking them by name. William felt stirring pride. This was not only his family's wealth at work, but a gesture of care for people's lives. He understood now what real power could be, the power to bring people together and improve their daily experiences. Back at home, father and son spent each morning walking through the gardens of the estate. They talked about everything from the tallest oak trees, age to William's plans for graduate school. Charles shared memories of his own youth, how he had learned to negotiate terms by watching his father over the din of a busy office, how he had felt excitement at seeing his first completed building. William shared his hopes of adding a research center for sustainable housing someday. One morning, William paused at a bed of roses. He closed his eyes and inhaled their sweet scent. "Father," he said, "thank you for letting me find my own." Charles rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "You earned it," he replied. "I will always listen." The bond between them grew stronger with each shared conversation. As the riverbank project moved forward, William took on more responsibilities at the company's office. He dressed in tailored suits, now chosen by him, not rented. He appeared at meetings with contractors, discussing timelines and budgets. He visited construction sites, wearing a hard hat and sturdy boots, talking to workers and asking about safety measures. He learned to read engineering reports and to ask smart questions. Charles watched with quiet pride as clients grew confident in William's abilities, offering him ideas and seeking his input. A few months after the gala, the first foundation was poured at the riverbank site. William stood beside Charles, both wearing matching jackets embroidered with the company logo. Together, they held golden shovels, ready for the ceremonial groundbreaking. Cameras flashed as they dug into the damp earth. William felt the cool soil against the shovel and realized this moment marked his true beginning. The earth, his father's work, and his own ideas were coming together in a shared act. After the ceremony, Charles clapped William on the back. "Look at us," he said, his voice warm with affection. "A team." William looked at his father, feeling respect and gratitude, mixing in his heart. "A team," he echoed. That evening, as they returned to the estate, William spoke about the next steps, talking to school administrators about a walking path to the local elementary school, researching solar panels for the community centers. Roof, Charles listened and offered suggestions from his years of experience. They made plans to visit a model sustainable village abroad to learn more. William realized how much he had grown since that night, standing alone under lanterns, wondering if he belonged. In the weeks before the first houses were built, William found himself waking early with excitement. He would study the blueprints, over coffee in the sunroom, or sketch ideas in a notebook while listening to birds outside. Charles noticed his son's enthusiasm and gave him a key to the office so he could enter early without waiting for security. William felt trusted and respected. One afternoon, Charles invited William to the board meeting. The full board of directors sat around a table gleaming with documents and laptops. Charles introduced William as the new Vice President of Community Development. William stood, straightening his tie, and spoke eloquently about neighbors' needs and inclusive design. The board members listened, some nodding, others jotting down notes. When he finished, the chairman stood and applauded, followed by others. William felt a surge of accomplishment. After the meeting, Charles and William walked to the parking area. Charles stopped by William's car and said, "I want you to drive us to the site tomorrow." William grinned. "I will." He realized how his father's gestures, big and small, showed him respect and offered him chances to lead. That night, father and son sat by the fire in the drawing room. They each held a drink hot cocoa for William and tea for Charles. The crackle of burning wood filled the room. They talked about the day's events and laughed over mistakes made when William first tried to impress clients with technical jargon. Charles admitted he had once confused to industry terms, and only later realized his error. William teased him gently, and Charles chuckled, the sound unguarded and warm, as the fire died down. William looked at his father and said, "I never thought business could feel so personal." Charles nodded. "That's the difference between building structures and building communities." William leaned back in his chair, satisfied. He felt he had found his place in his family and in the world his father had helped shape. In the days leading up to the first house completion, William walked the nearly finished street. He watched workers putting final touches on front doors painted in cheerful colors. He spoke to a mason smoothing brickwork and asked about his family's preferences for interior layouts. The mason told William that his neighbors appreciated the thought put into the design. William felt a calm joy knowing his ideas had made a difference. That evening, Charles joined William for a glass of wine by the fireplace. They raised their glasses in a quiet toast. Charles said, "To you, William, and to all we will build together." William smiled, heartful. "To us," he replied, in that warmth of shared purpose. Father and son knew they had bridged the gap between distance and understanding. The riverbank project would stand as a testament not only to their vision, but to their renewed bond. And in every home that opened its door to laughter and community, Charles and William's story of respect, love, and unity would live on. Charles woke before dawn the next morning, lantern light guiding his steps through the nearly finished street. He paused at the entrance to the first row of houses. Soft mist curled around the lampposts, and the air smelled of wet earth and fresh paint. William stood beside him, notebook in hand, watching as workers added final touches to lawns and hedges. The sun peeked over the horizon, casting the rosy glow of a new day. Charles felt a swell of pride at what they had built together, but he also sensed William's restless energy, knew his son was already thinking of challenges to solve and ways to improve their work. After breakfast, Charles and William toured the model home. Inside, linen curtains swayed gently in the soft breeze. The floors were polished wood floors, and sunlight warmed the living room. William pointed out the community garden window, explaining how families could watch their plants grow from this spot. Charles nodded and marveled at his son's attention to detail. They stepped outside onto the front porch and greeted the first family moving in, a young couple with a toddler in tow. The child waved shyly, and William knelt to say hello. Charles joined in, offering a welcome gift basket he had personally prepared. As the family thanked them, Charles saw that the warmth in their smiles was the true reward for their efforts. By midday, the street was alive with activity. Neighbors introduced themselves across fences. A local baker set up a small stall selling fresh bread. William joined her, asking about her plans for opening a shop in one of the small retail units. She spoke of her dream of a bakery where children could sample warm rolls after school. William listened and promised to help with permits and equipment. Later, Charles watched from a distance as his son offered advice to a school teacher who wanted to start after-school art classes in the community center. Charles felt a quiet pride, not for his own achievements, but for the way William had become the heart of this place. That afternoon, dark clouds gathered above the riverbank. A sudden summer storm rolled in with heavy wind and rain. Workers hurried to secure tools and cover open windows. William frowned as he watched rainwater begin to pool along the new sidewalks. He turned to Charles. "If we don't act fast, the flood could damage the foundations," he said. Charles felt his pulse quicken. He nodded, and together they led. A small team in shifting sandbags and clearing storm drains. The wind whipped against their jackets, and rain stung their faces. Yet they moved with purpose, side by side, father and son, united in urgent work. As the rain poured, William noticed a low spot near the community garden where water was gathering. He grabbed a spade and began digging a channel toward a nearby storm drain. Charles joined him with more sandbags. The ground grew muddy, and each step sank into soft soil. Neighbors saw them working and came to help. The baker set aside her stall and carried sandbags. The young couple fetched boards to reinforce the channel. Soon, a small army of new friends formed around Charles and William, all determined to protect their homes. Hours passed in a blur of motion. Rain lashed the soil, but the community's effort held the water back. At last, the floodwaters receded into the drain, leaving only damp earth behind. Exhausted but relieved, Charles and William stood soaked through. Mud splattered on their shoes. Neighbors cheered and clapped as if this victory belonged to them all. Charles looked at William, and their eyes met with a mix of relief and triumph. In that moment, Charles realized the deepest strength of their project. It had united people who would stand together in trouble. His son's quick thinking had saved the day. That evening, in the quiet after the storm, Charles and William returned. To the estate, they stripped off wet coats and warmed by the fireplace. Charles placed a blanket around William's shoulders. "You were brilliant today," he said with gentle pride. William shrugged, grinning. "I just saw what needed to be done." Charles sipped his tea and looked into the dancing flames. "You led people to help each other. You showed them they mattered." William's smile turned thoughtful. "That's what you taught me." Charles studied his son's face and realized that William had not only learned from him, but had become a teacher himself. In the days that followed, word of the storm and the community's response spread. A local newspaper ran a story headlined, "Neighbors Unite Under Young Leaders' Direction." They quoted William as saying, "When a family's home is at risk, no title matters more than being a good neighbor." Charles read the article with satisfaction. He called William into his study, and they reviewed the piece together. William pointed out phrases that showed his vision of unity. Charles nodded. "Your words carry weight," he said. "Use them well." William promised to keep speaking up for the people he served. As the last house sold, Charles and William organized a block party to celebrate. Long tables lined the street, covered with homemade dishes. Children ran between tables with laughter. An elderly neighbor played guitar as people danced on the sidewalks. William stood at the head of a table and raised a glass of lemonade, his chosen toast. Joined him, and together, they thanked everyone for their help. The crowd cheered, but beneath the joy lay a deeper bond. Charles realized that his son had transformed the idea of a housing project into a living community. Later that night, as Charles and William walked home under lantern light, they spoke about the future. William described his dream of adding a community college scholarship fund for students and their development. He talked about planting more trees and creating a small health clinic staffed by volunteer doctors. Charles listened and said, "Let's make each dream a plan." William beamed, and the two mapped out steps to raise funds and gather support. In the following weeks, Charles introduced William to charitable leaders and local officials. Attended meetings on scholarship fundraising, presenting his ideas with confidence. Charles watched as his son's network grew, and his compassion inspired others. Board members of Charles's company began to see William not just as a son, but as a leader in his own right. Charles felt a mix of pride and humility. He had once thought that wealth and power alone built great projects. Now he knew the true foundation was empathy and respect for every person involved. One afternoon, a well-known architect visited. To discuss plans for the next phase of development, he praised the first project's design, but asked about its heart. William spoke of how neighbors had saved homes during the storm and how that spirit must flow into the next designs. The architect nodded, impressed, and said he would adjust blueprints to include more gathering spaces and natural water channels. Charles smiled and shook the architect's hand. In William's guidance, he saw a new vision for their work, one that combined beauty with purpose. As autumn leaves began to fall, the company celebrated its first anniversary of the riverbank. Project Charles and William hosted a small ceremony where they planted a young oak tree in the community garden. William held the sapling steady, while Charles covered its roots with soil. Neighbors gathered around, placing hands on the tree and sharing hopes for its growth. Charles thought of how fragile and yet how strong that sapling was, just like their rebuilt bond. The next morning, Charles found William sitting by the garden, sketching future plans. William looked up, eyes bright. "I'm thinking of adding a solar array to power the community center," he said. Charles sat beside him and studied the drawing. "I love it," he said. "Let's do it." William smiled and returned to his sketching while Charles watched, content. He had come to understand that success was not a solo journey, but a shared path. That night, as Charles prepared for bed, he read a letter from William. In it, William wrote of gratitude for a chance to learn and grow, and of his dreams to carry on their work together. Charles folded the letter and placed it on his bedside table, closed his eyes and thought of the journey they had walked from a cold misunderstanding to a warm partnership. He realized that the true inheritance he could leave William was not money or buildings, but the trust and respect they had built together. With that thought, Charles drifted into a peaceful sleep, ready for the next chapter of their shared story. The crisp air of early winter settled over the riverbank community as Charles and William walked among the houses one last time before the holidays. The streetlights glowed softly along the sidewalks lined with evergreens and holiday wreaths. On each door, families bustled about decorating porches with strings of white lights, children's laughter echoing as they raced to hang handmade ornaments on the community center's giant pine. They had planted together, stood strong, its branches now bare, but its trunk wrapped in a ribbon of gold, symbol of the promise they had made. William stood beside him, breath visible in the cold air. He looked at the houses, the warm lights in every window, and felt a deep sense of home. "It feels different," he said quietly. "Like something I helped create belongs to everyone." Charles nodded and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You made it come alive," he said. "Your care turned a plan into a place where people truly live." They continued down the street to the community garden, where winter vegetables still peeked from the soil beneath a light dusting of frost. A few neighbors tended the last kale and carrots, wearing gloves and scarves. They greeted Charles and William with smiles and small waves. A schoolteacher knelt by the garden fence, tying a ribbon to mark where spring tulips would bloom. "Can't wait to see them, Mr. Beaumont," she said to William, using his name without hesitation. He smiled back, realizing how natural that felt now. No titles or distance, only shared care for the land and each other. Next, they entered the community center, where voices drifted from holiday rehearsals inside. Children stood on a low stage practicing carols, led by a local music teacher. Their small voices filled the hall with gentle song. Charles and William stood quietly at the back, listening as families gathered in folding chairs, faces bright with pride. When the final note faded, applause echoed, and the children beamed. William caught Charles's eye and nodded toward the stage. Without a word, Charles rose and called for attention. The room hushed again. Charles spoke in a clear, warm voice. "I want to thank each of you for making this place what it is," he said. "This community is more than houses and gardens. It is your stories, your laughter, and your shared strength." He turned to William. "I want to thank my son, William, who led so many of these efforts with heart and wisdom beyond his years." William felt his cheeks warm as people smiled and nodded. William stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "This center, these homes, and this garden exist because we all cared enough to stand together," he said. "When the storm came, you helped us save our street. When we needed your ideas, you gave them. You made every step a shared step." He paused, his voice softening. "I promise to keep listening to your hopes. I promise to keep working by your side." A wave of applause rose once more. Charles placed a proud hand on William's back as they clapped together. Later, the two walked back outside into the chill. The carolers had finished, and the hall lights glowed like candles through frosty windows. Charles looked at his son and said, "Shall we finish our walk?" William nodded, and they continued down the lane, past the houses where families had gathered for dinners and parties, past the little bakery that William had helped open, its window glowing with fresh bread smells, even in winter. They reached the entrance to the old town hall, now converted into the community library. Inside, a small group had gathered to write holiday cards for seniors living alone. William peered through the window. "They're making cards for Mrs. Patel," he said, referring to the widow who lived alone on Maple Street. "She loves getting mail." Charles smiled and knocked on the door. A volunteer opened it and waved them in. Inside, volunteers wrote messages of warmth and hope on colorful cards. William knelt beside the table and picked up a card, carefully wrote, "Warm wishes for the holidays. Your neighbors are thinking of you." A little girl beside him wrote her own message in big letters. Charles joined them and added his note. They folded the cards and placed them in envelopes. When they finished, the volunteers cheered softly, glad for the company. As they left, Charles realized how much the small acts added up: the storm help, the garden planting, the holiday cards. Each act had woven a tighter fabric of care across the community. He looked at William and said, "These hands you use, they carry kindness." William grinned at the praise. They walked on until they reached the riverbank itself. The stream glistened under a thin sheet of ice, reflecting the silver moon overhead. William knelt by the water's edge and picked up a small, smooth stone. He tossed it into the stream, sending ripples across the ice. Charles crouched beside him. "You remember the first time we saw this river?" Charles asked. William nodded. He was 10 then, chasing frogs with his father's old boots on. They had laughed as the frogs jumped away. "Yes," William said. "I remember falling into the mud." Charles chuckled. "I had to carry you back to the car, covered from head to toe." They shared a laugh at the memory. William looked at his father, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft, "for everything." Charles leaned over and hugged his son. "No," he said, "thank you." The two stood in silence a moment longer, listening to the soft rush of water beneath the ice and the occasional call of an owl in the trees. Charles thought of how far they had come from a lonely misunderstanding. On the estate lawn to this quiet moment by the river, they had learned to care for it together. They turned to walk back toward home, where a warm fireplace and mugs of spiced cider awaited. As they walked through the community gate, they passed under the arch of evergreen boughs strung with lanterns. Neighbors waved from their doorsteps, and children called out Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. Charles and William waved back, their hearts full. Inside the estate, they shed their coats and entered the drawing room. A fire crackled. In the hearth, and stockings hung by a mantel lined with pine cones and twinkling lights. Charles poured cider into 2 mugs and handed one to William. They settled into armchairs facing the fire. Charles raised his mug. "To the community we built," he said. William raised his and replied, "To the father who taught me how." They sipped their cider in companionable silence, watching flames dance. Outside, snow began to fall in soft flakes, dusting the windowsills and lawn. William pressed his palm against the cold glass and watched the snow settle on the evergreens. He turned to Charles. "This is home," he said simply. Charles smiled as he watched snowflakes drift down. "Yes," he said, "it is." They sat together, father and son, by the warm fire as winter night enveloped the world. In that quiet peace, Charles knew he had given William more than an inheritance of wealth. He had given him a place where kindness mattered, where people stood by one another. And William knew he had found a partner in his father, a friend and a guide for whatever came next. In the days and years to come, the riverbank community would grow and change, but the spirit they had built would endure. And whenever Charles and William walked its streets, they would remember the journey they had shared from a moment of cold confusion to the warmth of true connection. That bond would shape every plan, every design, and every dream they brought to life together.